It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. As the war in Ukraine continues, there's been a growing sense of dread that Russia is about to launch a major offensive, with the eastern regions of Ukraine in its sight. There have been disturbing, unconfirmed reports of chemical weapons being used, which allied countries are now trying to verify. Kyiv has called for heavier weapons and more assistance for its air force. And President Zelenskyy made an appeal to the South Korean parliament this week via video, calling for greater help from Seoul. We break down what many see as a very decisive moment in this war and South Korea's role in it as well. We connect with Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, and Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hangul University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both so much for joining us this morning. And well, let's start with you, Director Herring. Now, we've heard very disturbing, though unconfirmed, reports that Russia may have used chemical weapons. Now, President Biden last month, he said on the 24th that the United States would respond if such an attack occurred. If the reports are true, then, Director, what options are on the table right now?
Good morning, and thanks for having me back on your show. So we don't know. President Biden said that if chemical weapons are used, that there would be severe consequences. No one knows, and a lot of people think it's good that there's some ambiguity, that he has a wide range of options. I personally don't think that that's the wisest option. With Vladimir Putin, you need to be really explicit. But we still don't know if they use chemical weapons. The bottom line is that it's completely within reason that they have. They've used chemical weapons in other parts of the world, and we think that they were very frustrated that the Ukrainian soldiers in Mariupol would not give up. There were online reports of people from the People's Republic in eastern Ukraine saying that we have to use chemical weapons in order to get the Ukrainians to finally give up.
And Director Herring, now it seems a major attack by the Russians is imminent, and the UK has said that it expects fighting to intensify over the next 2 to 3 weeks. How have Russian troops recently been regrouping, and what kind of scenario are you expecting to see unfold?
So phase one is over, and the Ukrainians won phase one. Phase two is going to be quite a bit different, and I'm really concerned about phase two. So phase one favored the Ukrainian forces because they're smaller, nimble, they have civilian command structure, they have parliamentary oversight, they know how to work in smaller groups, and they were able to attack Russia's long convoys. Phase two is going to benefit the Russians. So the Ukrainians don't have as many men and as much artillery systems, planes, tanks. The second phase of this conflict is going to look a lot more like World War II, unfortunately. So that's why it's imperative right now for Seoul, for Washington, for Brussels, for Paris, to get as many planes, armored vehicles, S-300s, the anti-aircraft systems, the artillery systems that Kiev is requesting there as soon as possible. The Ukrainian side is expecting Moscow to escalate big time on the 14th, so in 2 days.
And certainly, President Zelenskyy has been making a personal appeal to many countries around the world. And Professor Ritchie, one of those countries includes South Korea, where the Ukrainian president made a video address to the parliament on Monday. And well, I wonder what you made of this video appeal and what this signifies about South Korea's expected role.
Sure. I think I would say three things. The first of which is that Zelenskyy here in South Korea, as he's done in other countries, has appealed to the national experience here in order to tug at the heartstrings of lawmakers and politicians. He did this in the UK, and Japan, and Germany, and the US, invoking Pearl Harbor, using the rhetoric from Winston Churchill in the case of Great Britain. Here in South Korea, of course, he referenced the Korean War and the division of the country, which it seems as though Russia might be trying to do in Ukraine. The second thing is, of course, that this was an expected step coming at a critical time in the Russia-Ukraine war, as you just pointed out. Ukraine's material is probably running low. The Russians have retrenched and regrouped away from Kiev and are, as we just heard, launching phase two. Ukraine, for its part, is looking to a counteroffensive in some places, and then looking to defend as best it can, especially in the eastern region. So it needs external support. And then thirdly, what this means for South Korea is, of course, it indicates that South Korea, has a potentially global role to play in security affairs. It means that South Korea is considered, quote unquote, on the right side of history. However, I would say that, frankly speaking, South Korea sort of embarrassed itself in this speech. The National Assembly turnout was really a disappointment. Only about 60 out of 300 lawmakers showed up. And I really think that might in some way be reflective of a political distraction here, but also, frankly, perhaps of the fact that the population here doesn't consider this to be a very pressing or critical issue.
But even so, many South Korean citizens have shown strong concern and they voice support for Ukrainians. And Professor Ritchie, how does the Ukraine crisis right now resonate with South Koreans, given their own history of fighting for liberation from Japanese colonization and also their decades-long fight for democracy?
Sure. So, I'm not going to paint with a broad brush and say, people in general or all Koreans don't really seem to care about this very much. Indeed, popular support for Ukraine is in theory high, but the population hasn't had to really face any sacrifices for that so far. I don't think it's still considered to be a critical issue for most people. Rather, they're concerned more about housing costs and inflation and domestic political issues, which is in some sense normal, of course. But again, this National Assembly turnout, I think, was, frankly speaking, kind of disgraceful. It wasn't the address wasn't even broadcast into the main conference hall. As I mentioned, turnout was low. And we have to remember, South Korea is a country that has been asking the rest of the world to support an end-of-war declaration in its own country with respect to North Korea. And of course, had 16 countries which sent combat forces during the 1950 to 1953 war. So the fact that you can't get a full house in the National Assembly is, I think, kind of sad, to be totally honest with you.
Well, it might be a funny time in South Korean politics, seeing as it's a time of transition with a new conservative government coming in, which has fortunately expressed more support for the efforts of the Ukrainians. And over in Ukraine, though, of course, the situation is just terribly serious at the moment. And Director Herring, now, there was news that Russia now has a new top general who's going to be leading the war in Ukraine on the Russian side. And well, it's drawn a lot of concern because he has quite a reputation now. Who is this person and what is his strategy?
So he's known as the Butcher of Aleppo. And he also made his name in Chechnya as well. He has a terrible reputation for being willing to kill civilians. He is indiscriminate and he will flatten cities. So this is a big deal. Part of the reason why the Ukrainians did so well in phase one is that there were at least 4 different Russian generals and they weren't communicating very well. And Vladimir Putin learned his lesson and he's consolidated power and he has one general in charge now. So all eyes are on the Donbass, on eastern Ukraine right now. And a lot of analysts think that Vladimir Putin needs to make real gains before by Victory Day in early May. He has to show something because he's lost a lot of troops and this has been very expensive and cost the average Russian a lot in their own individual bank accounts. So Mariupol needs to fall, that city in southeastern Ukraine that is besieged and has been besieged for 47 days. And he also needs to make some gains in the Donbass before that deadline.
And Director Herring, there's growing concern that when the Russians attack in full force in the Donbas region as well, it's not going to be like before where they were fighting in areas where the Ukrainians had an advantage because they'll be out on open fields. How do you think the strategy will change? And also, Ukraine has been calling for heavier weapons, more weapon support and also air support. What kind of support do they need exactly? And will the current level of support they're getting from the West be enough?
So to cut to the chase, no. The Ukrainians don't have the weapons that they need for phase 2, and they desperately need Seoul, Washington, Berlin, Paris to open up and start sending real weapons. I know there's a debate in Seoul and one in Washington as well, and a lot of policymakers want to divide aid into defensive weapons and then escalatory weapons. And there's been a hesitation to send escalatory weapons. I'm sorry, but when you go to the Donbass, when you go to Kiev, this distinction doesn't make any sense. I know that South Korea needs to defend itself. We in Washington need to have ample defense as well. But this is the time. The next 3 weeks are absolutely crucial. If Vladimir Putin is not stopped in the Donbass, he's going to level Kharkiv. He's going to level Kiev. And then yesterday or the day before, one of his top advisors gave an interview and they said, we're going to go after Europe next. So it's absolutely imperative that the West and Seoul and all the friends of Ukraine send planes, armored vehicles, S-300s, the anti-aircraft systems, the multiple rocket launch systems. There's a whole list of equipment that Kiev needs desperately in the next few days.
And the Ukrainian government has made this list very transparent, and they've been calling for these weapon support. And, well, Professor Ritchie, South Korea said that it could not provide lethal weapons to Ukraine due to its own security and military situation here in the Korean Peninsula. But to what extent can it provide military assistance?
Well, so far, Seoul has provided non-lethal material shipments, including bulletproof helmets, medical supplies, tents, blankets. It's made a $30 million commitment to financial aid for Ukraine. Private citizen donations have come in. And of course, Seoul, after a little bit of delay at first, has jumped on board more or less fully with sanctions support and diplomatic support for Ukraine. But that's not what Zelenskyy wants, as Deputy Director Herring just pointed out. Now, what he wants is lethal material. Frankly speaking, it seems hard to believe that South Korea can't spare some material. I don't completely believe the story that South Korea needs these weapon systems for its own defenses. But I think that there's an important question about what types of systems Ukraine can actually use. Ukraine is asking for anti-missile defenses. But frankly, this seems like a stretch for South Korea regarding, for instance, the need for training that Ukrainian soldiers would need with the particular systems here. The same thing might be the case for tanks. The story is potentially different for easier to use systems such as portable air defense systems and perhaps some anti-tank weapons. Ukraine has also asked for self-propelled artillery, Harpoon anti-missile systems. Here, I think the devil's in the details in terms of how many South Korea has. What it might be able to share, what the training level would be in terms of Ukrainian soldiers to train up on these systems. But in any event, South Korea doesn't seem inclined to offer these systems. So I don't think that Zelenskyy should count on Seoul to be delivering any of these lethal systems that he's just asked for.
Well, on that note, Professor Ritchie, now South Korea's initial response to the Ukraine crisis under the incumbent Moon government was admittedly bumpy. How will the incoming president, though, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, which has voiced stronger support for Ukraine, really handle things hopefully differently?
So, I've been on Arirang several times before. And I have talked to some degree about what the Yoon administration might be looking to do in terms of its foreign policy. It has referred to itself as wanting to lead South Korea to become a quote-unquote global pivotal state. And I think here we're really seeing the rubber hit the road. We're going to see whether or not the incoming Yoon administration and his foreign and security and defense policy team are going to be able to back up that aspiration. They want more global alliance multilateralism, so piggybacking on the U.S.-ROC alliance. But I think that the challenges that Yoon faces in the first place are going to be popular. He's going to have to get the population to jump behind Ukraine more. He's going to have to perhaps use some political capital if he wants to be more engaged in Ukraine. And of course, the situation in Ukraine on the ground might change, and that might change the imperatives that the Yoon administration will have to face. But as we saw, only having 60 out of 300 lawmakers there indicates at the very least the first thing he's going to have to do is rhetorically explain to everyone in the world why it's critical for South Korea to be engaged in Ukraine more. And of course, we're not exactly sure whether or not he thinks that's the case. So I think that right now this is still an open question.
And Director Herring, how long do you think Vladimir Putin will or can sustain this war?
So that's a great question. Some analysts think that he has army forces, capable army forces that can be sustained for the next 2 to 3 months. He has about 300,000 army troops. 150,000 of them have been deployed. He can draft as many people as he wants, but those draftees are not going to be trained, and they're going to be very green, inexperienced, and there will be a very high casualty rate. And he also has some limitations on him. He has not declared war. He's called this a special military operation or a special operation. And legally, constitutionally, he can't engage in conscription. Now, I'm sure he can find a way around it. I'm sure his lawyers can find a way around it. But there is sort of a question about Russian public opinion. If he does try to draft people, will the Russian public opinion put up with it? Between 70 and 80% of Russians support the war, but it's going to be a hard case to make that everything is hunky-dory, everything is going well, but we need a draft. So I have doubt about the wisdom, the political wisdom of conscription. Now, wars in this part of the world have a tendency to drag on much longer than they should and be much deadlier than they should. So we should not be talking about this in days or weeks, but I fear it's going to be months and maybe even years, unfortunately. I wish that weren't the case. But if you read Vladimir Putin's, the folks around him carefully, they're all saying that we are going to systematically level Ukraine city by city. We're not giving up. Our strategy may have changed. We're going to focus on the Donbass, but our goals haven't changed. And once we finish that, then we're going to come after Europe. So it's a very menacing picture. The threat from Moscow is long term, and we need to be wise in the way that we deal with it. And we need to realize that this is not just about Ukraine. That's why it's imperative for Seoul's government to get involved, and it's imperative for all of Ukraine's Western friends to get involved and do more than just send humanitarian aid.
That was Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, and Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you both again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.